This is the story of B-17 Mizpah and what really happened when it lost its entire nose section over Budapest on July 14, 1944. You've probably seen the famous photograph showing a flying fortress in flight with nothing ahead of the cockpit but empty air. And the legend says the crew flew for 10 minutes pulling bare control cables. Official military records tell a completely different story, and what you're about to hear will change how you understand one of the most famous images from World War II. We're going to walk through exactly what happened to aircraft 42-32109, separating verified facts from wartime embellishment, because the truth is remarkable enough without the mythology. 2 men died instantly, 8 survived, and somewhere between those 2 outcomes lies one of the most photographed and misunderstood moments of the air war over Europe. B-17G, serial number 42-32109, nicknamed Mizpah, lifted off from Tortorella, Italy on the morning of July 14, 1944, assigned to the 840th Bomb Squadron, 483rd Bomb Group, 15th Air Force. The target that day was the Ferencváros Railroad Yards in Budapest, Hungary, a major rail marshalling complex that the 15th Air Force had been systematically hitting as part of their campaign against Axis transportation infrastructure throughout southeastern Europe. The name Mizpah itself carries weight you need to understand. It's a Hebrew term meaning the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent from one another, and navigator Joseph Henderson's wife Mary had suggested it. By the end of that day's mission, the name would prove tragically prophetic in ways Mary Henderson could never have imagined. 10 men crewed Mizpah that morning, starting with pilot First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson from Escanaba, Michigan, and co-pilot Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt from Beloit, Wisconsin in the cockpit. Up in the nose compartment, that plexiglass greenhouse at the very front of the aircraft, sat Navigator Second Lieutenant Joseph Henderson, Jr. from Dallas, Texas, and Bombardier Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley from Detroit, Michigan. Behind them in the main fuselage were 6 enlisted men handling the guns and equipment. Technical Sergeant Frank Gramenzi as flight engineer and top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant George Simonelli on the radio, Staff Sergeant Arnold Kelly in the ball turret, Staff Sergeants Dale Hish and Wesley Tucker at the waist positions, and Staff Sergeant Charles Bell in the tail. Budapest was heavily defended, ringed with German 80mm anti-aircraft batteries manned by experienced crews who knew their business. The 483rd Bomb Group had been operational from Italy since April 1944, and they were already taking losses every time they flew. What happened next appears in Missing Aircrew Report 6901, which contains eyewitness statements from aircrew in nearby B-17s who watched the incident unfold in real time. Second Lieutenant John Turturro, flying an aircraft 4297792, put it this way: aircraft number 42-32109 received a direct hit in the nose, and the pilot had control of the ship for a few seconds while I saw him. Second Lieutenant Dwayne Goodwin described the moment differently. About 2/3 of the way down the bomb run, the nose of 109 peeled up as though something had cut it off. It fell back over the cockpit. The ship nosed up into the air, then settled back as though the pilot had control. Staff Sergeant Charles Stoll, Jr. added one horrifying detail. The nose blew over the cockpit of the ship, and the plane was covered with blood. An 80mm flak shell had scored a direct hit on the nose compartment, and the entire front section, where Henderson and Dudley sat, simply ceased to exist. One moment there was a nose, the next moment there wasn't, and Henderson and Dudley died instantly with no chance to react or escape. Here's where we need to pause and address something that might surprise you. The story you've probably heard, the one that's been repeated in books and articles and across the internet for decades, says that the crew flew for 10 minutes pulling bare control cables to keep the aircraft stable while the rest of the crew bailed out. That's not what the official military records say, and the discrepancy between legend and fact reveals how wartime stories get embellished over the decades. Every eyewitness statement in MACR 6901 describes only seconds of observed controlled flight. Turturro said, "A few seconds while I saw him, not minutes, not even 1 minute, just seconds." None of these eyewitness accounts mention crew members pulling control cables. Not one single statement includes that detail, and these were trained observers watching from nearby aircraft who knew what they were seeing. So where does the 10 minutes come from if the eyewitnesses only saw seconds? It appears in the unit histories Heroes of the 483rd and 483rd Bomb Group, which state that the pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer kept the plane under control for 10 minutes while the rest of the crew jumped, and this figure was reportedly confirmed by Pilot Swanson's post-war accounts and by family members of surviving crew members who spoke to researchers years later. The most likely explanation runs like this. Formation witnesses only saw the aircraft briefly before it fell away from the formation and dropped out of their view below and behind them. The 10 minutes probably represents the total time from damage to crash, most of which occurred after the aircraft left the observer's sight and was no longer visible to anyone who lived to document what they saw. The actual duration of meaningful pilot control remains genuinely uncertain, caught somewhere between seconds and minutes, with no way to verify which account is more accurate. As for the bare cables detail, that crew members physically grabbed and pulled exposed control cables to maneuver the aircraft. This does not appear in MACR 6901 anywhere. It may derive from post-war oral histories from survivors who told family members or reunion groups what happened, but it is not documented in official military records that were written while memories were fresh and details could be verified. I'm telling you this not to diminish what happened, but because the verified facts are remarkable enough without embellishment or Hollywood dramatization. What we know for certain is that after catastrophic damage that killed 2 men instantly and destroyed the front third of the aircraft, Pilot Swanson maintained sufficient control through whatever means available for 8 men to escape and survive the war. Whether that took 10 minutes or 10 seconds, whether cables were manually pulled or conventional controls somehow functioned, the outcome remained the same. 8 men lived who should have died, and that's what matters in the end. To understand what Swanson was dealing with in that moment, you need to understand what happens when a B-17 loses its nose section in flight. First comes massive drag from turning a streamlined aircraft into a brick with a giant hole in the front, with air rushing through that opening at over 150 miles per hour and creating turbulence throughout the fuselage that makes the aircraft want to shake itself apart. Second, the center of gravity shifts forward because the nose contained the navigator and bombardier compartment with relatively heavy equipment and 2 men. And when that's suddenly gone, the aircraft's balance point moves and affects how it handles every control input. Third, complete loss of forward vision hits the pilots, who sat behind the nose section, so when the nose peeled up and fell back over the cockpit, as eyewitness Goodwin described, Swanson and Berndt couldn't see where they were going or what was happening ahead of them. No windshield, no instruments, just wind and noise and blood everywhere they looked. Fourth, severe structural stress threatens the entire airframe because the B-17's fuselage was designed as an integrated structure, and removing a major section potentially weakens everything that remains. That the aircraft didn't immediately enter an unrecoverable dive speaks to both the B-17's structural margin and Swanson's skill under pressure. Eyewitness Goodwin noted the aircraft nosed up into the air, then settled back as though the pilot had control, suggesting Swanson overcame the initial pitch-up caused by the explosion and somehow brought the nose back down to a controllable angle. How B-17 controls actually worked. This part is critical for understanding what might have been possible in those moments after the hit. The B-17 used a conventional cable-operated mechanical flight control system, not hydraulic power for the primary controls, with steel cables running from the cockpit control column through the fuselage to the elevator for pitch control, the rudder for yaw, and the ailerons for roll. If the cockpit controls were severed, but the cables remained intact further aft. In the aircraft, direct manipulation of those cables could theoretically provide crude directional control to whoever was strong enough and desperate enough to try it. Whether that actually happened aboard Mizpah, we don't know from official records, but the possibility existed within the aircraft's design. The B-17G also featured an electric autopilot system for the Norden bomb site, which used electric motor servos mounted at the rudder and elevator and provided an alternative control pathway if mechanical cables were damaged. This detail gets overlooked in dramatic retellings, but it's potentially crucial to understanding how damaged B-17s remained flyable when conventional controls failed. Boeing deliberately over-engineered the B-17 for combat survivability, and the official training manual notes the aircraft could be flown successfully even when vertical or horizontal tail surfaces have been partially destroyed, or with one or more engines shot away. The airplane was built to take punishment and keep flying, and on July 14, 1944, Mizpah tested the outer limits of that design philosophy. The image you've seen, one of the most widely reproduced combat photographs of World War II, is absolutely genuine and authenticated by the National Archives. The reference number is 342 FH 3A JO 5477 53820 ARC, and the original wartime caption reads, "Hungary, after completing its bomb run over Budapest Ferencváros railroad yards on 14 July 1944, this Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was the victim of a direct hit by flak. 5 of the crew were seen to have bailed out, and the plane crashed." The photographer was Sergeant Robert W. Toombs, a waist gunner on B-17. Joanne, Aircraft 42 109849, piloted by Lieutenant Bob Orton, and Toombs had a Kodak Brownie camera with him that day. He captured 3 images of the stricken bomber as it fell away from the formation, and those photographs ended up in the National Archives and have been reproduced thousands of times since in books, documentaries, museums, and across the Internet. The early caption claiming only 5 crew bailed out and implying no survivors was incorrect. 8 of the 10 men aboard Mizpah survived, and that mistake in the official caption has caused confusion for decades among researchers trying to piece together what actually happened. At some point after the hit, whether seconds or minutes later, depending on which account you believe, the order came to abandon aircraft. 8 men bailed out over Hungary, and Swanson and Burnett would have been the last to leave after ensuring the rest of the crew had escaped through the hatches and into the slipstream. They parachuted into enemy territory, and all 8 were captured shortly after landing on Hungarian soil. Officers Swanson and Berndt were sent to Stalag Luft III at Sagan, Germany, the camp that would later become famous as the site of The Great Escape, immortalized in the Steve McQueen film. The enlisted crew members went to Stalag Luft IV, a separate facility for non-commissioned prisoners of war. Radio operator George Simonelli experienced something remarkable in captivity that shows how small the world can be, even in wartime. According to his grandson Rob Simonelli Jr., the German officer who interrogated him turned out to be someone Simonelli had known in high school in the United States before the war. Simonelli had tutored this man and protected him from bullying when they were teenagers, and the officer recognized Simonelli years later in an interrogation room in Germany, and remembering that kindness, treated him better during his imprisonment. In a war that killed millions across continents, small human connections still mattered and sometimes saved lives. All 8 survivors were liberated on April 30th, 1945, after spending nearly 10 months as prisoners of war watching the Third Reich collapse around them. Second Lieutenant Joseph Henderson Jr. and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley had no chance when that 80mm shell detonated in their compartment. Death was instantaneous, over before they could react or understand what was happening to them. Henderson is buried at Falconberry Cemetery in Groesbeck, Texas, and Dudley rests at Lorraine American Cemetery in France, Plot D, Row 22, Grave 31. They were doing their jobs when they died, Henderson navigating and Dudley preparing for the bomb run, sitting in the most exposed position on the aircraft where they could see to navigate and aim. It was also the position most vulnerable to flak coming up from the ground. The 483rd Bomb Group paid a heavy price throughout the war, losing 74 aircraft over 215 combat missions and suffering a 39.8% casualty and prisoner of war rate among original flying personnel. The group received 2 Distinguished Unit citations, one for missions to Memmingen, Germany on July 18, 1944, just 4 days after Mizpah went down, and another for Berlin on March 24, 1945. Henderson and Dudley were 2 names in that long casualty list. But they were also husbands, sons, men with futures that ended at 22 and 23 years old over a railroad yard in Budapest, and their families waited for them to come home from a war that had already taken them. Pilot Ewald Swanson came home and built a life that lasted another 65 years after that day over Budapest. He continued his military career and retired as a lieutenant colonel from the United States Air Force, then settled in Des Plaines, Illinois, where he served as an alderman and city treasurer and was active in the Des Plaines Elks Club, Lions Club, and American Legion. He attended many 483rd Bomb Group Association reunions over the years, and other survivors from Mizpah attended too, bound together by something they'd shared that nobody else could truly understand. February 28, 2009, Swanson died at Lutheran General Hospital at the age of 89. As far as we know, he was the last pilot to have flown a noseless B-17 for an extended period, however long that period actually was and whatever method he used to maintain control. His obituary mentioned his war service, and his family remembered him. But to truly understand what he did on July 14, 1944, you'd have needed to be there in that cockpit, with the wind screaming through the open fuselage and the controls responding or not responding to his touch. 8 lives depending on his ability to keep that wounded airplane stable long enough for them to jump. And he did that. The record is clear on that point, even if the details remain uncertain and debated. Mizpah's story gets conflated with other famous B-17 survival cases all the time, so we need to distinguish them clearly. All American Aircraft 41-24406 on February 1, 1943, had its tail nearly severed when a German Bf-109 collided with it over Tunisia, and the tail section was hanging on by a thread with the fuselage cut almost completely through. That aircraft made it back and landed safely in Algeria, and the photographs of that damage are stunning because you can see through the fuselage to the sky beyond and wonder how the thing stayed in the air. On October 15, 1944, a B-17 piloted by Lieutenant Delancey, Aircraft 43-38172, also lost its nose to flak just like Mizpah, and that aircraft actually made it back to England, flew all the way home across hostile territory and the English Channel, and landed, which makes you wonder why Mizpah couldn't do the same. Mizpah didn't make it home and crashed near Solt, also called Dunavexi, in Hungary. But its crew survived at a higher rate than many other incidents, 8 out of 10 men walking away when most noseless aircraft killed everyone aboard. Each case was different with unique challenges and circumstances. The common thread runs through them all. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name by being built to bring crews home, and even when catastrophically damaged, it often succeeded where other aircraft would have simply fallen out of the sky. The mission to Budapest was part of a larger strategic campaign that doesn't get as much attention as the 8th Air Force bombing Germany from England. The 15th Air Force, operating from bases in Italy, conducted extensive operations against Axis transportation infrastructure and oil production facilities in southeastern Europe throughout 1944, hitting targets the England-based bombers couldn't reach. Budapest was a critical target because it was a major rail hub connecting German forces in the Balkans to the rest of the Reich. Disrupting those rail lines meant disrupting supply routes, troop movements, and the flow of resources that kept the German war machine running in a region where they were fighting on multiple fronts. But hitting Budapest meant flying into some of the heaviest anti-aircraft defenses in Europe, and those 80-millimeter batteries were manned by experienced crews who'd been shooting at Allied bombers for years. The flak was accurate, it was deadly, and the 483rd Bomb Group knew the risks every time. They climbed into their aircraft. They flew the missions anyway because that's what they were there to do, and refusing wasn't an option any of them considered. Let's recap what the documentary record actually tells us versus what the legend claims. Verified with high confidence from primary sources, aircraft identity, date, unit assignment, crew roster, all check out. Cause of damage was an 88-millimeter flak direct hit, 2 killed in action, 8 prisoners of war who all survived and came home. The National Archives photograph is authentic and properly documented. Crash location near Solt in Hungary is confirmed. Partially verified from secondary sources with possible embellishment. The 10 minutes duration contradicts MACR eyewitnesses who saw only a few seconds of control, so it likely represents the total time from damage to crash rather than actual controlled flight. The claim that crew members pulled exposed control cables is not documented in official records and may derive from survivor oral history, but we don't have written verification from the time. Verified as false, early photo captions claiming no survivors when 8 of 10 crew survived. Any claim that the aircraft returned to base when Mizpah crashed in Hungary. Why does this matter, and why spend time distinguishing between 10 seconds and 10 minutes, between conventional controls and cable pulling? Because accuracy matters when we're talking about real men who lived and died, because these men deserve to have their actual accomplishments recorded instead of a Hollywood version, and because the verified facts are heroic enough without embellishment or mythology. Ewald Swanson kept that airplane under some form of control after it lost its nose. We know that because 8 men bailed out and lived, and whether he used the control column or cables or the electric autopilot or some combination, whether it took 10 seconds or 10 minutes, he gave his crew the chance to survive. That's what the record shows, and that's what matters when you cut through the legend to the truth. The photograph of Mizpah has become iconic in histories of the air war, appearing in books about the B-17, in documentaries and museums, becoming a symbol of the flying fortress's toughness and the courage of the men who flew them into hell. But every time you see that photograph, remember this. 2 men had just died where that nose used to be. 8 others were about to spend 10 months as prisoners of war, and a pilot was fighting to give his crew just a few more seconds or minutes of life. The 483rd Bomb Group flew 2 15 combat missions from April 1944 to April 1945, lost 74 aircraft, and hundreds of men served in that group. Most came home, but many didn't, and they flew B-17s with names like Mizpah and Lucky Lady and Hell's Angels into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe day after day, because that was the job. We remember Mizpah because of that photograph, but we should remember Mizpah because of what it represents, the cost of the air war, the courage of the crews, and the thin line between survival and death that every bomber crew walked every time they climbed into their aircraft and headed toward enemy territory. This is what happened to B-17 Mizpah on July 14, 1944, as best as we can determine from the documentary record available to us today. An 80-millimeter shell destroyed the nose, 2 men died instantly, and the pilot maintained control through whatever means and for whatever duration long enough for 8 others to bail out. All 8 survived the war and came home to build lives that the 2 dead men never got to live. The legend says 10 minutes and bare cables. The eyewitnesses say seconds. And the truth is probably somewhere in between, where we may never know exactly what happened. But here's what we do know for certain. When it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance between life and death, Ewald Swanson and Paul Berndt, and whoever else was helping them in that shattered aircraft, did what they needed to do. 8 men jumped, and 8 men lived. That's not legend or mythology or embellished war story. That's documented fact, verified by official records and the men who came home. And 65 years later, when Ewald Swanson died at age 89 in Illinois, he was remembered as a lieutenant colonel, a city alderman, a community leader who served his town for decades. But on one day in July 1944, he was something else entirely. He was a 24-year-old pilot fighting to save his crew, and he succeeded. The rest is just details that historians argue about while missing the point. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.